It rings a bell. It rings a bell. It rings a bell is a way to say something sounds familiar, right? It sounds familiar. I'm not sure. It rings a bell. It rings a bell. It rings a bell. Have you heard this one? It's coming. You've probably heard it in movies or TV or conversation, right? It rings a bell. Something rings a bell. Have you ever heard of the restaurant, or have you ever been to the restaurant where, and then you describe the restaurant? I don't know the name. It rings a bell, right? It sounds familiar. It sounds familiar. But where does this come from? Why do we say it rings a bell? What bell? What bell? But what does that mean? Well, it's kind of unclear a little bit where this idiom comes from, but most likely it comes from Pavlov's dog, the Pavlov dog experiment. Have you heard of that? It rings a bell. Is that the one where that he rang a bell before he gave the dogs food, and then eventually he would ring the bell and they would start to salivate, expecting food? Yeah, that's the one, right? It rings a bell. You see what I did there? But it rings a bell. So it rings a bell. It reminds them that food's coming. It rings a bell. It reminds you that something happened, or it sounds familiar. Ding. It rings a bell. So that is a possibility. Also, I don't know why, but bells are used to show that something is familiar a lot, or to have a good idea, right? You have a good idea. What happens in TV and cartoons or comedies? Ding, right? Ding, and maybe a light bulb flashes, doesn't it? So that is, it rings a bell. That it sounds familiar. Basically, it's a natural way, it's an expression to say something sounds familiar. It sounds familiar. It rings a bell. A very useful way, a very colloquial way, a good expression to use and to know to help you sound more fluent.